Welcome to the video. Today we're gonna see the Ballad of the Sad Café. I hope you enjoy.
The town itself is dreary, not much is there except the cotton mill, the two-room houses where the workers live, a few peach trees, a church with two colored windows, and a miserable main street only 100 yards long. One side is the tenants from the nearby farms coming for a day of talk and trade. Otherwise the town is lonesome, sad, and like a place that is far off and estranged from all other places in the world. The nearest train stop is Society City, and the Greyhound and White bus lines use the Forks Falls Road, which is 3 miles away. The winters here are short and raw, the summers white with glare and fiery hot. If you walk along the main street on an August afternoon, there is nothing whatsoever to do. The largest building, in the very center of the town, is boarded up completely and leans so far to the right that it seems bound to collapse at any minute. The house is very old. There is about it a curious, cracked look that is very puzzling until you suddenly realize that at one time, and long ago, the right side of the front porch had been painted, and part of the wall. But the painting was left unfinished and one portion of the house is darker and dingier than the other. The building looks completely deserted. Nevertheless, on the second floor there is one window which is not boarded. Sometimes in the late afternoon when the heat is at its worst, a hand will slowly open the shutter and a face will look down on the town. It is a face like the terrible dim faces known in dreams, sexless and white, with two grey crossed eyes which are turned inward so sharply that they seem to be exchanging with each other one long and secret gaze of grief. The face lingers at the window for an hour or so, then the shutters are dosed once more, and as likely as not there will not be another soul to be seen along the main street. These August afternoons, when your shift is finished, there is absolutely nothing to do. You might as well walk down to the Forks Falls Road and listen to the chain gang. However, here in this very town there was once a cafe, and this old boarded up house was unlike any other place for many miles around. There were tables with cloths and paper napkins, colored streamers from the electric fans, great gatherings on Sunday nights. The owner of the place was Miss Amelia Evans, but the person most responsible for the success and gaiety of the place was a hunchback called Cousin Lyman. One other person had a part in the story of this cafe. He was the former husband of Miss Amelia, a terrible character who returned to the town after a long term in the penitentiary, caused ruin, and then went on his way again. The cafe has long since been closed, but it is still remembered. The place was not always a cafe. Miss Amelia inherited the building from her father, and it was a store that carried mostly feed, guano, and staples such as meal and snuff. Miss Amelia was rich. In addition to the store, she operated a still 3 miles back in the swamp, and ran out the best liquor in the county. She was a dark, tall woman with bones and muscles like a man. Her hair was cut short and brushed back from the forehead, and there was about her sunburned face a tense, haggard quality. She might have been a handsome woman if, even then, she was not slightly cross-eyed. There were those who would have courted her, but Miss Amelia cared nothing for the love of men and was a solitary person. Her marriage had been unlike any other marriage ever contracted in this county. It was a strange and dangerous marriage, lasting only for 10 days, that left the whole town wondering and shocked. Except for this queer marriage, Miss Amelia had lived her life alone. Often she spent whole nights back in her shed in the swamp, dressed in overalls and gum boots, silently guarding the low fire of the still. With all things which could be made by the hands, Miss Amelia prospered. She sold chitterlings and sausage in the town nearby. On fine autumn days, she ground sorghum, and the syrup from her vats was dark golden and delicately flavored. She built the brick privy behind her store in only 2 weeks and was skilled in carpentry. It was only with people that Miss Amelia was not at ease. People, unless they are nilly-willy or very sick, cannot be taken into the hands and changed overnight to something more worthwhile and profitable. So that the only use that Miss Amelia had for other people was to make money out of it, and in this she succeeded. Mortgages on crops and property, a sawmill, money in the bank, she was the richest woman for miles around. She would have been rich as a congressman if it were not for her one great failing, and that was her passion for lawsuits and the courts. She would involve herself in long and bitter litigation over just a trifle. It was said that if Miss Amelia so much as stumbled over a rock in the road, she would glance around instinctively as though looking for something to sue about it. Aside from these lawsuits, she lived a steady life, and every day was very much like the day that had gone before. With the exception of her 10-day marriage, nothing happened to change this until the spring of the year that Miss Amelia was 30 years old. It was toward midnight on a soft, quiet evening in April. The sky was the color of a blue swamp iris, the moon clear and bright. The crops that spring promised well, and in the past weeks the mill had run a night shift. Down by the creek, the square brick factory was yellow with light, and there was the faint, steady hum of the looms. It was such a night when it is good to hear from far away, across the dark fields, the slow song of a Negro on his way to make love. or when it is pleasant to sit quietly and pick a guitar, or simply to rest alone and think of nothing at all. The street that evening was deserted, but Miss Amelia's store was lighted, and on the porch outside there were 5 people. One of these was Stumpy MacPhail, a foreman with a red face and dainty, purplish hands. On the top step were 2 boys in overalls, the Rainey twins, both of them lanky and slow, with white hair and sleepy green eyes. The other man was Henry Macy, a shy and timid person with gentle manners and nervous ways, who sat on the edge of the bottom step. Miss Amelia herself stood leaning against the side of the open door, her feet crossed in the big swamp boots, patiently untying knots in a rope she had come across. They had not talked for a long time. One of the twins, who had been looking down the empty road, was the first to speak. "I see something coming," he said. "A calf got loose," said his brother. The approaching figure was still too distant to be clearly seen. The moon made dim, twisted shadows of the blossoming peach trees along the side of the road. In the air the odor of blossoms and sweet spring grass mingled with the warm, sour smell of the nearby lagoon. "No, it's somebody's young one," said Stumpy MacPhail. Miss Amelia watched the road in silence. She had put down her rope and was fingering the straps of her overalls with her brown bony hand. She scowled, and a dark lock of hair fell down on her forehead. While they were waiting there, a dog from one of the houses down the road began a wild, hoarse howl that continued until a voice called out and hushed it. It was not until the figure was quite close, within the range of the yellow light from the porch, that they saw dearly what had come. The man was a stranger, and it is rare that a stranger enters the town on foot at that hour. Besides, the man was a hunchback. He was scarcely more than 4 feet tall, and he wore a ragged, dusty coat that reached only to his knees. His crooked little legs seemed too thin to carry the weight of his great warped chest, and the hump that sat on his shoulders. He had a very large head, with deep-set blue eyes and a sharp little mouth. His face was both soft and sassy. At the moment his pale skin was yellowed by dust and there were lavender shadows beneath his eyes. He carried a lopsided old suitcase which was tied with a rope. "Evening," said the hunchback, and he was out of breath. Miss Amelia and the men on the porch neither answered his greeting nor spoke. They only looked at him. "I am hunting for Miss Amelia Evans." Miss Amelia pushed back her hair from her forehead and raised her chin. "How come?" "Because I am kin to her," the hunchback said. The twins and Stumpy MacPhail looked up at Miss Amelia. "That's me," she said. "How do you mean, kin?" "Because," the hunchback began. He looked uneasy, almost as though he was about to cry. He rested the suitcase on the bottom step, but did not take his hand from the handle. "My mother was Fanny Jessup and she come from Chehaw. She left Chehaw some 30 years ago when she married her first husband. I remember hearing her tell how she had a half-sister named Martha. And back in Chehaw today they tell me that was your mother." Miss Amelia listened with her head turned slightly aside. She ate her Sunday dinners by herself. Her place was never crowded with a flock of relatives, and she claimed kin with no one. She had had a great aunt who owned the livery stable in Chehaw, but that aunt was now dead. Aside from her there was only one double first cousin who lived in a town 20 miles away, but this cousin and Miss Amelia did not get on so well, and when they chanced to pass each other they spat on the side of the road. Other people had tried very hard, from time to time, to work out some kind of far-fetched connection with Miss Amelia, but with absolutely no success. The hunchback went into a long rigmarole, mentioning names and places that were unknown to the listeners on the porch and seemed to have nothing to do with the subject. So Fanny and Martha Jessup were half-sisters, and I am the son of Fanny's third husband. So that would make you and I. He bent down and began to unfasten his suitcase. His hands were like dirty sparrow daws and they were trembling. The bag was full of all manner of junk, ragged clothes and odd rubbish that looked like parts out of a sewing machine, or something just as worthless. The hunchback scrambled among these belongings and brought out an old photograph. "This is a picture of my mother and her half-sister." Miss Amelia did not speak. She was moving her jaw slowly from side to side, and you could tell from her face what she was thinking about. Stumpy MacPhail took the photograph and held it out toward the light. It was a picture of 2 pale, withered-up little children of about 2 and 3 years of age. The faces were tiny white blurs, and it might have been an old picture in anyone's album. Stumpy MacPhail handed it back with no comment. "Where you come from?" he asked. The hunchback's voice was uncertain. "I was traveling." Still Miss Amelia did not speak. She just stood leaning against the side of the door and looked down at the hunchback. Henry Macy winked nervously and rubbed his hands together. Then quietly he left the bottom step and disappeared. He is a good soul, and the hunchback's situation had touched his heart. Therefore he did not want to wait and watch Miss Amelia chase this newcomer off her property and run him out of town. The hunchback stood with his bag open on the bottom step. He sniffled his nose and his mouth quivered. Perhaps he began to feel his dismal predicament. Maybe he realized what a miserable thing it was to be a stranger in the town with a suitcase full of junk and claiming kin with Miss Amelia. At any rate, he sat down on the steps and suddenly began to cry. It was not a common thing to have an unknown hunchback walk to the store at midnight and then sit down and cry. Miss Amelia rubbed back her hair from her forehead and the men looked at each other uncomfortably. All around the town was very quiet. At last one of the twins said, "I'll be damned if he ain't a regular Morris Feinstein." Everyone nodded and agreed, for that is an expression having a certain special meaning. But the hunchback cried louder because he could not know what they were talking about. Morris Feinstein was a person who had lived in the town years before. He was only a quick, skipping little Jew who cried if you called him Christ killer, and ate light bread and canned salmon every day. A calamity had come over him and he had moved away to Society City. But since then, if a man were prissy in any way, or if a man ever wept, he was known as a Morris Feinstein. "Well, he is afflicted," said Stumpy MacPhail. "There is some cause." Miss Amelia crossed the porch with 2 slow, gangling strides. She went down the steps and stood looking thoughtfully at the stranger. Gingerly, with one long brown forefinger, she touched the hump on his back. The hunchback still wept, but he was quieter now. The night was silent and the moon still shone with a soft, dear light. It was getting colder. Then Miss Amelia did a rare thing. She pulled out a bottle from her hip pocket and after polishing off the top with the palm of her hand, she handed it to the hunchback to drink. Miss Amelia could seldom be persuaded to sell her liquor on credit, and for her to give so much as a drop away free was almost unknown. "Drink," she said. "It will liven your gizzard." The hunchback stopped crying, neatly licked the tears from around his mouth, and did as he was told. When he was finished, Miss Amelia took a slow swallow, warmed and washed her mouth with it, and spat. Then she also drank. The twins and the foreman had their own bottle they had paid for. "It is smooth liquor," Stumpy MacPhail said. "Miss Amelia, I have never known you to fail." The whiskey they drank that evening is important. Otherwise, it would be hard to account for what followed. Perhaps without it there would never have been a cafe, for the liquor of Miss Amelia has a special quality of its own. It is clean and sharp on the tongue, but once down a man it glows inside him for a long time afterward. And that is not all. It is known that if a message is written with lemon juice on a clean sheet of paper there will be no sign of it. But if the paper is held for a moment to the fire then the letters turn brown, and the meaning becomes clear. Imagine that the whiskey is the fire, and that the message is that which is not only in the soul of a man. Then the worth of Miss Amelia's liquor can be understood. Things that have gone unnoticed, thoughts that have been harbored far back in the dark mind, are suddenly recognized and comprehended. A spinner who has thought only of the loom, the dinner pail, the bed, and then the loom again. This spinner might drink some on a Sunday and come across a marsh lily, and in his palm he might hold this flower, examining the golden dainty cup, and in him suddenly might come a sweetness keen as pain. A weaver might look up suddenly and see for the first time the cold, weird radiance of midnight January sky, and a deep fright at his own smallness stopped his heart. Such things as these, then, happen when a man has drunk Miss Amelia's liquor. He may suffer, or he may be spent with joy, but the experience has shown the truth. He has warmed his soul and seen the message hidden there. They drank until it was past midnight, and the moon was clouded over so that the night was cold and dark. The hunchback still sat on the bottom steps, bent over miserably with his forehead resting on his knee. Miss Amelia stood with her hands in her pockets, one foot resting on the second step of the stairs. She had been silent for a long time. Her face had the expression often seen in slightly cross-eyed persons who are thinking deeply, a look that appears to be both very wise and very crazy. At last she said, "I don't know your name." "I'm Lyman Willis," said the hunchback. "Well, come on in," she said. "Some supper was left in the stove and you can eat." Only a few times in her life had Miss Amelia invited anyone to eat with her, unless she were planning to trick them in some way or make money out of it. So the men on the porch felt there was something wrong. Later, they said among themselves that she must have been drinking back in the swamp the better part of the afternoon. At any rate, she left the porch, and Stumpy MacPhail and the twins went on off home. She bolted the front door and looked all around to see that her goods were in order. The hunchback hovered so close behind her that the swinging light made on the staircase wall one great, twisted shadow of the two of them. Soon the premises above the store were dark as the rest of the town. The next morning was serene, with a sunrise of warm purple mixed with rose. In the fields around the town the furrows were newly plowed, and very early the tenants were at work setting out the young, deep green tobacco plants. The wild crows flew down close to the fields, making swift blue shadows on the earth. In town the people set out early with their dinner pails, and the windows of the mill were blinding gold in the sun. The air was fresh, and the peach trees light as March clouds with their blossoms. Miss Amelia came down at about dawn, as usual. She washed her head at the pump and very shortly said about her business. Later in the morning she saddled her mule and went to see about her property, planted with cotton, up near the Forks Falls Road. By noon, of course, everybody had heard about the hunchback who had come to the store in the middle of the night, but no one as yet had seen it. The day soon grew hot and the sky was a rich midday blue. Still no one had laid an eye on this strange guest. A few people remembered that Miss Amelia's mother had had a half-sister, but there was some difference of opinion as to whether she had died or had run off with a tobacco stringer. As for the hunchback's claim, everyone thought it was a trumped-up business. And the town, knowing Miss Amelia, decided that surely she had put him out of the house after feeding it. But toward evening, when the sky had whitened, and the shift was done, a woman claimed to have seen a crooked face at the window of one of the rooms up over the store. Miss Amelia herself said nothing. She clerked in the store for a while, argued for an hour with a farmer over a plow shaft, mended some chicken wire, locked up near sundown, and went to her rooms. The town was left puzzled and talkative. The next day Miss Amelia did not open the store, but stayed locked up inside her premises and saw no one. Now this was the day that the rumor started. The rumor so terrible that the town and all the country about were stunned by it. The rumor was started by a weaver called Merle Ryan. He is a man of not much account, sallow, shambling, and with no teeth in his head. He has the 3-day malaria, which means that every 3rd day the fever comes on it. So on 2 days he is dull and cross, but on the 3rd day he lightens up and sometimes has an idea or two, most of which are foolish. It was while Merle Ryan was in his fever that he turned suddenly and said, "I know what Miss Amelia done. She murdered that man for something in that suitcase." He said this in a calm voice as a statement of fact, and within an hour the news had swept through the town. It was a fierce and sickly tale the town built up that day. In it were all the things which caused the heart to shiver: a hunchback, a midnight burial in the swamp, the dragging of Miss Amelia through the streets of the town on the way to prison, the squabbles over what would happen to her property, all told in hushed voices and repeated with some fresh and weird detail. It rained and women forgot to bring in the washing from the lines. 1 or 2 mortals, who were in debt to Miss Amelia, even put on Sunday clothes as though it were a holiday. People clustered together on the main street, talking and watching the store. It would be untrue to say that all the town took part in this evil festival. There were a few sensible men who reasoned that Miss Amelia, being rich, would not go out of her way to murder a vagabond for a few trifles of junk. In the town there were even 3 good people, and they did not want this crime, not even for the sake of the interest and the great commotion it would entail. It gave them no pleasure to think of Miss Amelia holding to the bars of the penitentiary and being electrocuted in Atlanta. These good people judged Miss Amelia in a different way from what the others judged her. When a person is as contrary in every single respect as she was, and when the sins of a person have amounted to such a point that they can hardly be remembered all at once, then this person plainly requires a special judgment. They remembered that Miss Amelia had been born dark and somewhat queer of face, raised motherless by her father, who was a solitary man. That early in youth she had grown to be 6 feet 2 inches tall, which in itself is not natural for a woman, and that her ways and habits of life were too peculiar ever to reason about. Above all, they remembered her puzzling marriage, which was the most unreasonable scandal ever to happen in this town. So these good people felt toward her something near to pity, and when she was out on her wild business, such as rushing in a house to drag forth a sewing machine in payment for a debt, or getting herself worked up over some matter concerning the law, they had toward her a feeling which was a mixture of exasperation, a ridiculous little inside tickle, and a deep, unnameable sadness. But enough of the good people, for there were only 3 of them. The rest of the town was making a holiday of this fancy crime the whole of the afternoon. Miss Amelia herself, for some strange reason, seemed unaware of all this. She spent most of her day upstairs. When down in the store, she prowled around peacefully, her hands deep in the pockets of her overalls and head bent so low that her chin was tucked inside the collar of her shirt. There was no blood stain on her anywhere. Often she stopped and just stood somberly looking down at the cracks in the floor, twisting a lock of her short cropped hair and whispering something to herself. But most of the day was spent upstairs. Dark came on. The rain that afternoon had chilled the air, so that the evening was bleak and gloomy as in wintertime. There were no stars in the sky, and a light, icy drizzle had set in. The lamps in the houses made mournful, wavering flickers when watched from the street. A wind had come up, not from the swamp side of the town, but from the cold black pinewoods to the north. The clocks in the town struck 8. Still nothing had happened. The bleak night, after the gruesome talk of the day, put a fear in some people, and they stayed home close to the fire. Others were gathered in groups together. Some 8 or 10 men had convened on the porch of Miss Amelia's store. They were silent and were indeed just waiting about. They themselves did not know what they were waiting for, but it was this in times of tension. When some great action is impending, men gather and wait in this way. And after a time there will come a moment when altogether they will act in unison, not from thought or from the will of any one man, but as though their instincts had merged together so that the decision belongs to no single one of them, but to the group as a whole. At such a time, no individual hesitates, and whether the matter will be settled peaceably, or whether the joint action will result in ransacking, violence, and crime, depends on destiny. So the men waited soberly on the porch of Miss Amelia's store, not one of them realizing what they would do, but knowing inwardly that they must wait, and that the time had almost come. Now the door to the store was open. Inside it was bright and natural looking. To the left was the counter where slabs of white meat, rock candy, and tobacco were kept. Behind these were shelves of salted white meat and meal. The right side of the store was mostly filled with farm implements and such. At the back of the store, to the left, was the door leading up the stairs, and it was open. And at the far right of the store there was another door which led to a little room that Miss Amelia called her office. This door was also open, and at 8 o'clock that evening Miss Amelia could be seen there sitting before her roll-top desk, figuring with a fountain pen and some pieces of paper. The office was cheerfully lighted, and Miss Amelia did not seem to notice the delegation on the porch. Everything around her was in great order as usual. This office was a room well known, in a dreadful way, throughout the country. It was there Miss Amelia transacted all business. On the desk was a carefully covered typewriter which she knew how to run, but used only for the most important documents. In the drawers were literally thousands of papers, all filed according to the alphabet. This office was also the place where Miss Amelia received sick people, for she enjoyed doctoring and did a great deal of it. 2 whole shelves were crowded with bottles and various paraphernalia. Against the wall was a bench where the patients sat. She could sew up a wound with a burn needle so that it would not turn green. For burns she had a cool, sweet syrup. For unlocated sickness there were any number of different medicines which she had brewed herself from unknown recipes. They wrenched loose the bowels very well, but they could not be given to small children, as they caused bad convulsions. For them she had an entirely separate draught, gentler and sweet flavor. Yes, all in all, she was considered a good doctor. Her hands, though very large and bony, had a light touch about them. She possessed great imagination, and used hundreds of different cures. In the face of the most dangerous and extraordinary treatment she did not hesitate, and no disease was so terrible but what she would undertake to cure it. In this there was one exception. If a patient came with a female complaint she could do nothing. Indeed, at the mere mention of the words her face would slowly darken with shame, and she would stand there craning her neck against the collar of her shirt, or rubbing her swamp boots together, for all the world like a great shamed, dumb-tongued child. But in other matters people trusted her. She charged no fees whatsoever and always had a raft of patients. On this evening, Miss Amelia wrote with her fountain pen a good deal, but even so she could not be forever unaware of the group waiting out there on the dark porch, and watching her. From time to time she looked up and regarded them steadily, but she did not holler out to them to demand why they were loafing around her property like a sorry bunch of gabbies. Her face was proud and stern, as it always was when she sat at the desk of her office. After a time their peering in like that seemed to annoy her. She wiped her cheek with a red handkerchief, got up, and closed the office door. Now to the group on the porch this gesture acted as a signal. The time had come. They had stood for a long while with the night raw and gloomy in the street behind them. They had waited long, and just at that moment the instinct to act came on them. All at once, as though moved by one will, they walked into the store. At that moment the 8 men looked very much alike, all wearing blue overalls, most of them with whitish hair, all pale of face, and all with a set, dreaming look in the eye. What they would have done next no one knows. But at that instant there was a noise at the head of the staircase. The men looked up and then stood down with shock. It was the hunchback, whom they had already murdered in their minds. Also, the creature was not at all as had been pictured to them, not a pitiful and dirty little chatterer, alone and beggared in this world. Indeed, he was like nothing any man among them had ever beheld until that time. The room was still as death. The hunchback came down slowly with the proudness of one who owns every plank of the floor beneath his feet. In the past days he had greatly changed. For one thing, he was clean beyond words. He still wore his little coat, but it was brushed off and neatly mended. Beneath this was a fresh red and black checkered shirt belonging to Miss Amelia. He did not wear trousers such as ordinary men are meant to wear, but a pair of tight-fitting little knee-length breeches. On his skinny legs he wore black stockings, and his shoes were of a special kind, being queerly shaped, laced up over the ankles, and newly cleaned and polished with wax around his neck, so that his large, pale ears were almost completely covered. He wore a shawl of lime green wool, the fringes of which almost touched the floor. The hunchback walked down the store with his stiff little strut, and then stood in the center of the group that had come inside. They cleared a space about him and stood looking with hands loose at their sides and eyes wide open. The hunchback himself got his bearings in an odd manner. He regarded each person steadily at his own eye level, which was about belt line for an ordinary man. Then with shrewd deliberation he examined each man's lower regions, from the waist to the sole of the shoe. When he had satisfied himself, he closed his eyes for a moment and shook his head, as though in his opinion what he had seen did not amount to much. Then with assurance, only to confirm himself, he tilted back his head and took in the halo of faces around him with one long, circling stare. There was a half-filled sack of guano on the left side of the store, and when he had found his bearings in this way, the hunchback sat down upon it. Cozily settled, with his little legs crossed, he took from his coat pocket a certain object. Now it took some moments for the men in the store to regain their ease. Merle Ryan, he of the 3-day fever who had started the rumor that day, was the first to speak. He looked at the object which the hunchback was fondling and said in a hushed voice, "What is it you have there?" Each man knew well what it was the hunchback was Hamlet, for it was the snuff-box which had belonged to Miss Amelia's father. The snuff-box was of blue enamel with a dainty embellishment of wrought gold on the lid. The group knew it well and marveled. They glanced warily at the closed office door and heard the low sound of Miss Amelia whistling to herself. "Yes, what is it?" "We not." The hunchback looked up quickly and sharpened his mouth to speak. "Why, this is a lay-low to catch meddlers." The hunchback read it in the box with his scrambly little fingers and ate something, but he offered no one around him a taste. It was not even proper snuff which he was taking, but a mixture of sugar and cocoa. This he took, though, as snuff, pocketing a little wad of it beneath his lower lip and licking down neatly into this with a flick of his tongue which made a frequent grimace come over his face. "The very teeth in my head have always tasted sour to me," he said in explanation. "That is the reason why I take this kind of sweet snuff." The group still clustered around, feeling somewhat gawky and bewildered. This sensation never quite wore off, but it was soon tempered by another feeling, an air of intimacy in the room and a vague festivity. Now the names of the men of the group there on that evening were as follows: Hasty Malone, Robert Calvert Hale, Merle Ryan, Reverend T.M. Willett, Rosser Klein, Rip Wellborn, Henry Ford Cream, and Horace Wells. Except for Reverend Willett, they are owl-like in many ways, as has been said, all having taken pleasure from something or other, all having wept and suffered in some way, most of them tractable unless exasperated. Each of them worked in the mill and lived with others in a 2 or 3 room house for which the rent was $10 or $12 a month. All had been paid that afternoon, for it was Saturday. So, for the present, think of them as a whole. The hunchback, however, was already sorting them out in his mind. Once comfortably settled, he began to chat with everyone, asking questions such as if a man was married, how old he was, how much his wages came to in an average week, etc., picking his way along to inquiries which were downright intimate. Soon the group was joined by others in the town. Henry Macy, idlers who had sensed something extraordinary, women come to fetch their men who lingered on, and even one loose, toed child who tiptoed into the store, stole a box of animal crackers, and made off very quietly. So the premises of Miss Amelia were soon crowded, and she herself had not yet opened her office door. There is a type of person who has a quality about him that sets him apart from other and more ordinary human beings. Such a person has an instinct which is usually found only in small children, an instinct to establish immediate and vital contact between himself and all things in the world. Certainly the hunchback was of this type. He had only been in the store half an hour before an immediate contact had been established between him and each other individual. It was as though he had lived in the town for years, was a well-known character, and had been sitting and talking there on that guano sack for countless evenings. This, together with the fact that it was Saturday night, could account for the air of freedom and illicit gladness in the store. There was a tension, also, partly because of the oddity of the situation, and because Miss Amelia was still closed off in her office and had not yet made her appearance. She came out that evening at 10 o'clock, and those who were expecting some drama at her entrance were disappointed. She opened the door and walked in with her slow, gangling swagger. There was a streak of ink on one side of her nose, and she had knotted the red handkerchief about her neck. She seemed to notice nothing unusual. Her great, crossed eyes glanced over to the place where the hunchback was sitting, and for a moment lingered there. The rest of the crowd in her store she regarded with only a peaceable surprise. "Does anyone want waiting on?" she asked quietly. There were a number of customers, because it was Saturday night and they all wanted liquor. Now Miss Amelia had dug up an aged barrel only 3 days past, and had siphoned it into bottles backed by the still. This night she took the money from the customers and counted it beneath the bright light. Such was the ordinary procedure. But after this what happened was not ordinary. Always before, it was necessary to go around to the dark backyard, and there she would hand out your bottle through the kitchen door. There was no feeling of joy in the transaction. After getting his liquor, the customer walked off into the night. Or, if his wife would not have it in the home, he was allowed to come back around to the front porch of the store and guzzle there or in the street. Now, both the porch and the street before it were the property of Miss Amelia, and no mistake about it, but she did not regard them as her premises. The premises began at the front door and took in the entire inside of the building. There she had never allowed liquor to be opened or drunk by anyone but herself. Now, for the first time, she broke this rule. She went to the kitchen, with the hunchback close at her heels, and she brought back the bottles into the warm, bright store. More than that, she furnished some glasses and opened 2 boxes of crackers so that they were there hospitably in a platter on the counter, and anyone who wished could take one free. She spoke to no one but the hunchback, and she only asked him in a somewhat harsh and husky voice, "Cousin Lyman, will you have yours straight or warm in a pan with water on the stove?" "If you please, Amelia," the hunchback said. "If you please, I'll have it warm." Now, this was the beginning of the cafe. It was as simple as that. Recall that the night was gloomy as in wintertime, and to have sat around the property outside would have made a sorry celebration. But inside there was company and a genial warmth. Someone had rattled up the stove in the rear, and those who bought bottles shared their liquor with friends. Several women were there and they had twists of licorice, a nehi, or even a swallow of the whiskey. The hunchback was still a novelty, and his presence amused everyone. The bench in the office was brought in, together with several extra chairs. Other people leaned against the counter or made themselves comfortable on barrels and sacks. Nor did the opening of liquor on the premises cause any rambunctiousness, indecent giggles, or misbehavior whatsoever. On the contrary, the company was polite even to the point of a certain timidness. For people in this town were then unused to gathering together for the sake of pleasure. They met to work in the mill, or on Sunday there would be an all-day camp meeting, and though that is a pleasure, the intention of the whole affair is to sharpen your view of hell and put into you a keen fear of the Lord Almighty. But the spirit of a cafe is altogether different. Even the richest, greediest old rascal will behave himself, insulting no one in a proper cafe. And poor people look about them gratefully and pinch up the salt in a dainty and modest manner. For the atmosphere of a proper cafe implies these qualities: fellowship, the satisfactions of the belly, and a certain gaiety and grace of behavior. This had never been told to the gathering in Miss Amelia's store that night, but they knew it of themselves, although never, of course, until that time had there been a cafe in the town. Now, the cause of all this, Miss Amelia stood most of the evening in the doorway leading to the kitchen. Outwardly, she did not seem changed at all, but there were many who noticed her face. She watched all that went on, but most of the time her eyes were fastened lonesomely on the hunchback. He strutted about the store, eating from his snuff box and being at once sour and agreeable. Where Miss Amelia stood, the light from the chinks of the stove cast a glow, so that her brown, long face was somewhat brightened, and she seemed to be looking inward. There was in her expression pain, perplexity, and uncertain joy. Her lips were not so firmly set as usual, and she swallowed often. Her skin had paled and her large empty hands were sweating. Her look that night, then, was the lonesome look of the lover. This opening of the cafe came to an end at midnight. Everyone said goodbye to everyone else in a friendly fashion. Miss Amelia shut the front door of her premises, but forgot to bolt it. Soon everything, the main street with its 3 stores, the mill, the houses, all the town, in fact, was dark and silent. And so ended 3 days and nights in which had come an arrival of a stranger, an unholy holiday, and the start of the cafe. No time must pass, for the next 4 years are much alike. There are great changes, but these changes are brought about bit by bit in simple steps which in themselves do not appear to be important. The hunchback continued to live with Miss Amelia. The cafe expanded in a gradual way. Miss Amelia began to sell her liquor by the drink, and some tables were brought into the store. There were customers every evening, and on Saturday a great crowd. Miss Amelia began to serve fried catfish suppers at 15 cents a plate. The hunchback cajoled her into buying a fine mechanical piano. Within 2 years the place was a store no longer, but had been converted into a proper cafe, open every evening from 6 until 12 o'clock. Each night the hunchback came down the stairs with the air of one who has a grand opinion of himself. He always smelled slightly of turnip greens, as Miss Amelia rubbed him night and morning with pot liquor to give him strength. She spoiled him to a point beyond reason, but nothing seemed to strengthen him. Food only made his hump and his head grow larger, while the rest of him remained weakly and deformed. Miss Amelia was the same in appearance. During the week she still wore swamp boots and overalls, but on Sunday she put on a dark red dress that hung on her in a most peculiar fashion. Her manners, however, and her way of life were greatly changed. She still loved a fierce lawsuit, but she was not so quick to cheat her fellow man and to exact cruel payments. Because the hunchback was so extremely sociable, she even went about a little to revivals, to funerals, and so forth. Her doctoring was as successful as ever, her liquor even finer than before, if that were possible. The cafe itself proved profitable, and was the only place of pleasure for many miles around. Moment regard these years from random and disjointed views. See the hunchback marching in Miss Amelia's footsteps when on a red winter morning they set out for the pine woods to hunt. See them working on her properties, with Cousin Lyman standing by and doing absolutely nothing, but quick to point out any laziness among the hands. On autumn afternoons they sat on the back steps chopping sugarcane. The glaring summer days they spent back in the swamp where the water cypress is a deep black green, where beneath the tangled swamp trees there is a drowsy gloom. And when the path leads through a bog or a stretch of blackened water, see Miss Amelia bend down to let Cousin Lyman scramble on her back, and see her wading forward with the hunchback settled on her shoulders, clinging to her ears or to her broad forehead. Occasionally Miss Amelia cranked up the Ford which she had bought and treated Cousin Lyman to a picture show in Chehaw, or to some distant fair or cockfight. The hunchback took a passionate delight in spectacles. Of course, they were in their cafe every morning. They would often sit for hours together by the fireplace in the parlor upstairs, for the hunchback was sickly at night and dreaded to lie looking into the dark. He had a deep fear of death, and Miss Amelia would not leave him by himself to suffer with this fright. It may even be reasoned that the growth of the cafe came about mainly on this account. It was a thing that brought him company and pleasure, and that helped him through the night, so composed from such flashes an image of these years as a whole, and for a moment let it rest. Now some explanation is due for all this behavior. The time has come to speak about love, for Miss Amelia loved Cousin Lyman. So much was clear to everyone. They lived in the same house together and were never seen apart. Therefore, according to Mrs. MacPhail, a wordy-nosed old busybody who is continually moving her sticks of furniture from one part of the front room to another, according to her and to certain others, these two were living in sin. If they were related, they were only a cross between first and second cousins, and even that could in no way be proved. Now, of course, Miss Amelia was a powerful blunderbuss of a person, more than 6 feet tall, and Cousin Lyman a weakly little hunchback reaching only to her waist. But so much the better for Mrs. Stumpy MacPhail and her cronies, for they and their kind glory in conjunctions which are ill-matched and pitiful. So let them be. The good people thought that if those two had found some satisfaction of the flesh between themselves, then it was a matter concerning them and God alone. All sensible people agreed in their opinion about this conjecture, and their answer was a plain, flat top. What sort of thing, then, was this love? First of all, love is a joint experience between two persons, but the fact that it is a joint experience does not mean that it is a similar experience to the two people involved. They are the lover and the beloved, but these two come from different countries. Often the beloved is only a stimulus for all the stored-up love which has lain quiet within the lover for a long time hitherto. And somehow every lover knows this. He feels in his soul that his love is a solitary thing. He comes to know a new, strange loneliness, and it is this knowledge which makes him suffer. So there is only one thing for the lover to do. He must house his love within himself as best he can. He must create for himself a whole new inward world, a world intense and strange, complete in himself. Let it be added here that this lover about whom we speak need not necessarily be a young man saving for a wedding ring. This lover can be man, woman, child, or indeed any human creature on this earth. Now, the beloved can also be of any description. The most outlandish people can be the stimulus for love. A man may be a doddering great-grandfather and still love only a strange girl he saw in the streets of Chehaw one afternoon 2 decades past. The preacher may love a fallen woman. The beloved may be treacherous, greasy-headed, and given to evil habits. Yes, and the lover may see this as dearly as anyone else, but that does not affect the evolution of his love one whit. A most mediocre person can be the object of a love which is wild, extravagant, and beautiful as the poison lilies of the swamp. A good man may be the stimulus for a love both violent and debased, or a jabbering madman may bring about in the soul of someone a tender and simple ideal. Therefore, the value and quality of any love is determined solely by the lover himself. It is for this reason that most of us would rather love than be loved. Almost everyone wants to be the lover, and the curt truth is that, in a deep secret way, the state of being beloved is intolerable to many. The beloved fears and hates the lover, and with the best of reasons, for the lover is forever trying to strip bare his beloved. The lover craves any possible relation with the beloved, even if this experience can cause him only pain. It has been mentioned before that Miss Amelia was once married, and this curious episode might as well be accounted for at this point. Remember that it all happened long ago, and that it was Miss Amelia's only personal contact before the hunchback came to her with this phenomenon, love. The town then was the same as it is now, except there were 2 stores instead of 3, and the peach trees along the street were more crooked and smaller than they are now. Miss Amelia was 19 years old at the time, and her father had been dead many months. There was in the town at that time a loom fixer named Marvin Macy. He was the brother of Henry Macy, although to know them you would never guess that those two could be kin. For Marvin Macy was the handsomest man in this region, being 6 feet 1 inch tall, hard muscled, and with slow gray eyes and curly hair. He was well off, made good wages, and had a gold watch which opened in the back to a picture of a waterfall. From the outward and worldly point of view, Marvin Macy was a fortunate fellow. He needed to bow and scrape to no one and always got just what he wanted. But from a more serious and thoughtful viewpoint, Marvin Macy was not a person to be envied, for he was an evil character. His reputation was as bad, if not worse, than that of any young man in the county. For years, when he was a boy, he had carried about with him the dried and salted ear of a man he had killed in a razor fight. He had chopped off the tails of squirrels in the pinewoods just to please his fancy, and in his left hip pocket he carried forbidden marijuana weed to tempt those who were discouraged and drawn toward death. Yet in spite of his well-known reputation, he was the beloved of many females in this region, and there were at the time several young girls who were clean-haired and soft-eyed, with tender, sweet little buttocks and charming ways. These gentle young girls he degraded and shamed. Then finally, at the age of 22, this Marvin Macy chose Miss Amelia. That solitary, gangling, queer-eyed girl was the one he longed for. Nor did he want her because of her money, but solely out of love. And love changed Marvin Macy. Before the time when he loved Miss Amelia, it could be questioned if such a person had within him a heart and soul. Yet there is some explanation for the ugliness of his character, for Marvin Macy had had a hard beginning in this world. He was one of 7 unwanted children whose parents could hardly be called parents at all. These parents were wild young guns who liked to fish and roam around the swamp. Their own children. And there was a new one almost every year, were only a nuisance to them. At night when they came home from the mill, they would look at the children as though they did not know wherever they had come from. If the children cried, they were beaten, and the first thing they learned in this world was to seek the darkest corner of the room and try to hide themselves as best they could. They were as thin as little white-haired ghosts, and they did not speak, not even to each other. Finally, they were abandoned by their parents altogether and left to the mercies of the town. It was a hard winter, with the mill closed down almost 3 months, and much misery everywhere. But this is not a town to let white orphans perish in the road before your eyes. So here is what came about. The eldest child, who was 8 years old, walked into Chiha and disappeared. Perhaps he took a freight train somewhere and went out into the world. Nobody knows. 3 other children were boarded out amongst the town, being sent around from one kitchen to another, and as they were delicate they died before Easter tide. The last 2 children were Marvin Macy and Henry Macy, and they were taken into a home. There was a good woman in the town named Mrs. Mary Hale, and she took Marvin Macy and Henry Macy and loved them as her own. They were raised in her household and treated well. But the hearts of small children are delicate organs. A cruel beginning in this world can twist them into curious shapes. The heart of a hurt child can shrink so that forever afterward it is hard and bitter as the seed of a peach. Or again, the heart of such a child may fester and swell until it is a misery to carry within the body, easily chafed and hurt by the most ordinary things. This last is what happened to Henry Macy, who is so opposite to his brother, is the kindest and gentlest man in town. He lends his wages to those who are unfortunate, and in the old days he used to care for the children whose parents were at the cafe on Saturday night. But he is a shy man, and he has the look of one who has a swollen heart and suffers. Marvin Macy, however, grew to be bold and fearless and cruel. His heart turned tough as the horns of Satan, and until the time when he loved Miss Amelia he brought to his brother and the good woman who raised him nothing but shame and trouble. But love reversed the character of Marvin Macy. For 2 years he loved Miss Amelia, but he did not declare himself. He would stand near the door of her premises, his cap in his hand, his eyes meek and longing and misty gray. He reformed himself completely. He was good to his brother and foster mother, and he saved his wages and learned thrift. Moreover, he reached out toward God. No longer did he lie around on the floor of the front porch all day Sunday. Singing and playing his guitar, he attended church service and was present at all religious meetings. He learned good manners, he trained himself to rise and give his chair to a lady, and he quit swearing and fighting and using holy names in vain. So for 2 years he passed through this transformation and improved his character in every way. Then at the end of the 2 years he went one evening to Miss Amelia, carrying a bunch of swamp flowers, a sack of chitolins, and a silver ring. That night Marvin Macy declared himself, and Miss Amelia married him. Later everyone wondered why. Some said it was because she wanted to get herself some wedding presents. Others believed it came about through the nagging of Miss Amelia's great aunt in Chiha. who was a terrible old woman. Anyway, she strode with great steps down the aisle of the church wearing her dead mother's bridal gown, which was of yellow satin and at least 12 inches too short for her. It was a winter afternoon and the clear sun shone through the ruby windows of the church and put a curious glow on the pair before the altar. As the marriage lines were read, Miss Amelia kept making an odd gesture. She would rub the palm of her right hand down the side of her satin wedding gown. She was reaching for the pocket of her overalls, and being unable to find it, her face became impatient, bored, and exasperated. At last, when the lines were spoken and the marriage prayer was done, Miss Amelia hurried out of the church, not taking the arm of her husband, but walking at least 2 paces ahead of it. The church is no distance from the store, so the bride and groom walked home. It is said that on the way, Miss Amelia began to talk about some deal she had worked up with a farmer over a load of kindling wood. In fact, she treated her groom in exactly the same manner she would have used with some customer who had come into the store to buy a pine from her. But so far all had gone decently enough. The town was gratified, as people had seen what this love had done to Marvin Macy and hoped that it might also reform his bride. At least, they counted on the marriage to tone down Miss Amelia's temper, to put a bit of bride fat on her, and to change her at last into a calculable woman. They were wrong. The young boys who watched through the window on that night said that this is what actually happened. The bride and groom ate a grand supper prepared by Jeff, the old Negro who cooked for Miss Amelia. The bride took second servings of everything, but the groom picked with his food. Then the bride went about her ordinary business, reading the newspaper, finishing an inventory of the stock in the store, and so forth. The groom hung about in the doorway with a loose, foolish, blissful face and was not noticed. At 11 o'clock, the bride took a lamp and went upstairs. The groom followed close behind her. So far all had gone decently enough, but what followed after was unholy. Within half an hour, Miss Amelia had stomped down the stairs in breeches and a khaki jacket. Her face had darkened so that it looked quite black. She slammed the kitchen door and gave it an ugly kick. Then she controlled herself. She poked up the fire, sat down, and put her feet up on the kitchen stove. She read the Farmer's Almanac, drank coffee, and had a smoke with her father's pipe. Her face was hard, stern, and had now whitened to its natural color. Sometimes she paused to jot down some information from the almanac on a piece of paper. Toward dawn, she went into her office and uncovered her typewriter, which she had recently bought and was only just learning how to run. That was the way in which she spent the whole of her wedding night. At daylight, she went out to her yard as though nothing whatsoever had occurred and did some carpentering on a rabbit hutch which she had begun the week before and intended to sell somewhere. A groom is in a sorry fix when he is unable to bring his well-beloved bride to bed with him, and the whole town knows it. Marvin Macy came down that day still in his wedding finery and with a sick face. God knows how he had spent the night. He moped about the yard, watching Miss Amelia, but keeping some distance away from her. Then toward noon an idea came to him and he went off in the direction of Society City. He returned with presents, an opal ring, a pink enamel dooring of the sort which was then in fashion, a silver bracelet with 2 hearts on it, and a box of candy which had cost $2.50. Miss Amelia looked over these fine gifts and opened the box of candy, for she was hungry. The rest of the presents she judged shrewdly for a moment to sum up their value, then she put them in the counter out for sale. The night was spent in much the same manner as the preceding one, except that Miss Amelia brought her feather mattress to make a pallet by the kitchen stove, and she slept fairly well. Things went on like this for 3 days. Miss Amelia went about her business as usual, and took great interest in some rumor that a bridge was to be built some 10 miles down the road. Marvin Macy still followed her about around the premises, and it was plain from his face how he suffered. Then on the 4th day he did an extremely simple-minded thing. He went to Chiha and came back with a lawyer. Then in Miss Amelia's office he signed over to her the whole of his worldly goods, which was 10 acres of timberland which he had bought with the money he had saved. She studied the papers thoroughly to make sure there was no possibility of a trick and filed it soberly in the drawer of her desk. That afternoon Marvin Macy took a quart bottle of whiskey and went with it alone out in the swamp while the sun was still shining. Toward evening he came in drunk, went up to Miss Amelia with wet white eyes, and put his hand on her shoulder. He was trying to tell her something, but before he could open his mouth she had swung once with her fist and hit his face so hard that he was thrown back against the wall and one of his front teeth was broken.
The rest of this affair can only be mentioned in bare outline. After this first blow, Miss Amelia hit him whenever he came within arm's reach of her and whenever he was drunk. At last she turned him off the premises altogether, and he was forced to suffer publicly. During the day he hung around just outside the boundary line of Miss Amelia's property, and sometimes with a drawn, crazy look he would fetch his rifle and sit there cleaning it, peering at Miss Amelia steadily. If she was afraid she did not show it, but her face was sterner than ever, and often she spat on the ground. His last foolish effort was to climb in the window of her store one night, and to sit there in the dark, for no purpose whatsoever, until she came down the stairs next morning. For this, Miss Amelia set off immediately to the courthouse in Chehaw with some notion that she could get him locked in the penitentiary for trespassing. Marvin Macy left the town that day, and no one saw him go or knew just where he went.
On leaving, he put a long, curious letter, partly written in pencil and partly with ink, beneath Miss Amelia's door. It was a wild love letter, but in it were also included threats, and he swore that in his life he would get even with her. His marriage had lasted for 10 days, and the town felt the special satisfaction that people feel when someone has been thoroughly done in by some scandalous and terrible means. Miss Amelia was left with everything that Marvin Macy had ever owned: his timberwood, his gilt watch, every one of his possessions. But she seemed to attach little value to them, and that spring she cut up his clansman's robe to cover her tobacco plants. So all that he had ever done was to make her richer and to bring her love. But, strange to say, she never spoke of him but with a terrible and spiteful bitterness. She never once referred to him by name, but always mentioned him scornfully as that loom fixer I was married to. And later, when horrifying rumors concerning Marvin Macy reached the town, Miss Amelia was very pleased, for the true character of Marvin Macy finally revealed itself. Once he had freed himself of his love, he became a criminal whose picture and whose name were in all the papers in the state. He robbed 3 filling stations and held up the A&P store of Society City with a sawed-off gun.
He was suspected of the murder of Slit-Eye Sam, who was a noted hijacker. All these crimes were connected with the name of Marvin Macy, so that his evil became famous through many countries. Then finally the law captured him, drunk, on the floor of a tourist cabin, his guitar by his side, and $57 in his right shoe. He was tried, sentenced, and sent off to the penitentiary near Atlanta. Miss Amelia was deeply gratified. Well, all this happened a long time ago, and it is the story of Miss Amelia's marriage. The town laughed a long time over this grotesque affair. But though the outward facts of this love are indeed sad and ridiculous, it must be remembered that the real story was that which took place in the soul of the lover himself. So who but God can be the final judge of this or any other love? On the very first night of the cafe, there were several who suddenly thought of this broken bridegroom, locked in the gloomy penitentiary many miles away.
And in the years that followed, Marvin Macy was not altogether forgotten in the town. His name was never mentioned in the presence of Miss Amelia or the hunchback, but the memory of his passion and his crimes, and the thought of him trapped in his cell in the penitentiary, was like a troubling undertone beneath the happy love of Miss Amelia and the gaiety of the cafe. So do not forget this Marvin Macy, as he is to act a terrible part in the story which is yet to come.
During the 4 years in which the store became a cafe, the rooms upstairs were not changed. This part of the premises remained exactly as it had been all of Miss Amelia's life, as it was in the time of her father, and most likely his father before him. The 3 rooms, it is already known, were immaculately clean. The smallest object had its exact place, and everything was wiped and dusted by Jeff, the servant of Miss Amelia, each morning. The front room belonged to Cousin Lyman. It was the room where Marvin Macy had stayed during the few nights he was allowed on the premises, and before that it was the bedroom of Miss Amelia's father. The room was furnished with a large chifforo, a bureau covered with a stiff white linen cloth crocheted at the edges, and a marble-topped table. The bed was immense, an old 4-poster made of carved, dark rosewood. On it were 2 feather mattresses, bolsters, and a number of handmade comforts. The bed was so high that beneath it were 2 wooden steps. No occupant had ever used these steps before, but Cousin Lyman drew them out each night and walked up in state. Beside the steps, but pushed modestly out of view, there was a china chamber pot painted with pink roses. No rug covered the dark, polished floor, and the curtains were of some white stuff, also crocheted at the edges. On the other side of the parlor was Miss Amelia's bedroom, and it was smaller and very simple. The bed was narrow and made of pine. There was a bureau for her breeches, shirts, and Sunday dress, and she had hammered 2 nails in the closet wall on which to hang her swamp boots. There were no curtains, rugs, or ornaments of any kind. The large middle room, the parlor, was elaborate. The rosewood sofa, upholstered in threadbare green silk, was before the fireplace. Marble-top tables, 2 Singer sewing machines, a big vase of pampas grass, everything was rich and grand. The most important piece of furniture in the parlor was a big, glass-door cabinet in which was kept a number of treasures and curios. Miss Amelia had added 2 objects to this collection. One was a large acorn from a water oak, the other a little velvet box holding 2 small, grayish stones. Sometimes, when she had nothing much to do, Miss Amelia would take out this velvet box and stand by the window with the stones in the palm of her hand, looking down at them with a mixture of fascination, dubious respect, and fear. They were the kidney stones of Miss Amelia herself, and had been taken from her by the doctor in Chehaw some years ago. It had been a terrible experience, from the first minute to the last, and all she had got out of it were those 2 little stones. She was bound to set great store by them, or else admit to a mighty sorry bargain. So she kept them, and in the second year of Cousin Lyman's stay with her she had them set as ornaments in a watch chain which she gave to him. The other object she had added to the collection, the large acorn, was precious to her, but when she looked at it her face was always saddened and perplexed. "Amelia, what does it signify?" Cousin Lyman asked her. "Why, it's just an acorn," she answered. "Just an acorn I picked up on the afternoon Big Papa died." "How do you mean?" Cousin Lyman insisted. "I mean it's just an acorn I spied on the ground that day. I picked it up and put it in my pocket, but I don't know why. What a peculiar reason to keep it," Cousin Lyman said. The talks of Miss Amelia and Cousin Lyman in the rooms upstairs, usually in the first few hours of the morning when the hunchback could not sleep, were many. As a rule, Miss Amelia was a silent woman, not letting her tongue run wild on any subject that happened to pop into her head. There were certain topics of conversation, however, in which she took pleasure. All these subjects had one point in common: they were interminable. She liked to contemplate problems which could be worked over for decades and still remain insoluble. Cousin Lyman, on the other hand, enjoyed talking on any subject whatsoever, as he was a great chatterer. Their approach to any conversation was altogether different. Miss Amelia always kept to the broad, rambling generalities of the matter, going on endlessly in a low, thoughtful voice and getting nowhere, while Cousin Lyman would interrupt her subtly to pick up, magpie fashion, some detail which, even if unimportant, was at least concrete and bearing on some practical facet close at hand. Some of the favorite subjects of Miss Amelia were the stars, the reason why Negroes are black, the best treatment for cancer, and so forth. Her father was also an interminable subject which was dear to her. "Why, Law," she would say to Lyman, "those days I slept. I'd go to bed just as the lamp was turned on and sleep. Why, I'd sleep like I was drowned in warm axle grease. Then come daybreak, Big Papa would walk in and put his hand down on my shoulder. 'That's stirring, little,' he would say. Then later he would holler up the stairs from the kitchen when the stove was hot fried grits. He would holler, 'White meat and gravy, ham and eggs,' and I'd run down the stairs and dress by the hot stove while he was out washing at the pump. Then off we'd go to the still, or maybe, the grits we had this morning was poor," Cousin Lyman said, "fried too quick so that the inside never heated." And when Big Papa would run off the liquor in those days, the conversation would go on endlessly, with Miss Amelia's long legs stretched out before the hearth. For winter or summer there was always a fire in the grate, as Lyman was cold-natured. He sat in a low chair across from her, his feet not quite touching the floor and his torso usually well wrapped in a blanket or the green wool shawl.
Miss Amelia never mentioned her father to anyone else except Cousin Lyman. That was one of the ways in which she showed her love for him. He had her confidence in the most delicate and vital matters. He alone knew where she kept the chart that showed where certain barrels of whiskey were buried on a piece of property nearby. He alone had access to her bank book and the key to the cabinet of curios. He took money from the cash register, whole handfuls of it, and appreciated the loud jingle it made inside his pockets. He owned almost everything on the premises, for when he was cross Miss Amelia would prowl about and find him some present, so that now there was hardly anything left close at hand to give him. The only part of her life that she did not want Cousin Lyman to share with her was the memory of her 10-day marriage. Marvin Macy was the one subject that was never, at any time, discussed between the two of them. So let the slow years pass and come to a Saturday evening 6 years after the time when Cousin Lyman came first to the town. It was August and the sky had burned above the town like a sheet of flame all day. Now the green twilight was near and there was a feeling of repose. The street was coated an inch deep with dry golden dust, and the little children ran about half naked, sneezed often, sweated, and were fretful. The mill had closed down at noon. People in the houses along the main street sat resting on their steps, and the women had palmetto fans.
At Miss Amelia's there was a sign at the front of the premises saying cafe. The back porch was cool with lattice shadows, and their Cousin Lyman sat turning the ice cream freezer. Often he unpacked the salt and ice and removed the dasher to lick a bit and see how the work was coming on. Jeff cooked in the kitchen. Early that morning, Miss Amelia had put a notice on the wall of the front porch reading, "Chicken dinner, 20 cents tonight." The cafe was already open and Miss Amelia had just finished a period of work in her office. All the 8 tables were occupied and from the mechanical piano came a jingling tune. In a corner near the door and sitting at a table with a child was Henry Macy. He was drinking a glass of liquor, which was unusual for him, as liquor went easily to his head and made him cry or sing. His face was very pale and his left eye worked constantly in a nervous tick, as he was apt to do when he was agitated. He had come into the cafe sidewise and silent, and when he was greeted he did not speak. The child next to him belonged to Horace Wells, and he had been left at Miss Amelia's that morning to be doctored. Miss Amelia came out from her office in good spirits. She attended to a few details in the kitchen, and entered the cafe with the Pope's nose of a hen between her fingers, as that was her favorite piece. She looked about the room, saw that in general all was well, and went over to the corner table by Henry Macy. She turned the chair around and sat straddling the back, as she only wanted to pass the time of day and was not yet ready for her supper. There was a bottle of croup cure in the hip pocket of her overalls, a medicine made from whiskey, rock candy, and a secret ingredient. Miss Amelia uncorked the bottle and put it to the mouth of the child. Then she turned to Henry Macy and, seeing the nervous winking of his left eye, she asked, "What ails you?" Henry Macy seemed on the point of saying something difficult, but after a long look into the eyes of Miss Amelia, he swallowed and did not speak. So Miss Amelia returned to her patient. Only the child's head showed above the tabletop. His face was very red, with the eyelids half closed and the mouth partly open. He had a large, hard, swollen boil on his thigh, and had been brought to Miss Amelia so that it could be opened. But Miss Amelia used a special method with children. She did not like to see them hurt, struggling, and terrified. So she had kept the child around the premises all day, giving him licorice and frequent doses of the croup cure, and toward evening she tied a napkin around his neck and let him eat his fill of the dinner. Now as he sat at the table his head wobbled slowly from side to side, and sometimes as he breathed there came from him a little worn-out grunt. There was a stir in the cafe and Miss Amelia looked around quickly. Cousin Lyman had come in. The hunchback strutted into the cafe as he did every night, and when he reached the exact center of the room he stopped short and looked shrewdly around him, summing up the people and making a quick pattern of the emotional material at hand that night.
The hunchback was a great mischief maker. He enjoyed any kind of to-do, and without saying a word he could set the people at each other in a way that was miraculous. It was due to him that the Rainey twins had quarreled over a jackknife 2 years past, and had not spoken one word to each other since. He was present at the big fight between Rip Wellborn and Robert Calvert-Hale, and every other fight for that matter since he had come into the town. He nosed around everywhere, knew the intimate business of everybody, and trespassed every waking hour. Yet, queerly enough, in spite of this it was the hunchback who was most responsible for the great popularity of the cafe. Things were never so gay as when he was around.
When he walked into the room there was always a quick feeling of tension, because with this busybody about there was never any telling what might descend on you, or what might suddenly be brought to happen in the room. People are never so free with themselves, and so recklessly glad as when there is some possibility of commotion or calamity ahead. So when the hunchback merged into the cafe everyone looked around at him, and there was a quick outburst of talking, and a drawing of corks. Lyman waved his hand to Stumpy MacPhail, who was sitting with Merle Ryan and Henry Ford Crimp. "I walked to Rotten Lake today to fish," he said, "and on the way I stepped over what appeared at first to be a big fallen tree.
But then as I stepped over I felt something stir, and I taken this second look, and there I was straddling this here alligator long as from the front door to the kitchen and thicker than a hog." The hunchback chattered on. Everyone looked at him from time to time, and some kept track of his chattering and others did not. There were times when every word he said was nothing but lying and bragging. Nothing he said tonight was true. He had lain in bed with a summer quinsy all day long, and had only got up in the late afternoon in order to turn the ice cream freezer.
Everybody knew this, yet he stood there in the middle of the cafe and held forth with such lies and boasting that it was enough to shrivel the ears. Miss Amelia watched him with her hands in her pockets and her head turned to one side. There was a softness about her gray, queer eyes, and she was smiling gently to herself. Occasionally she glanced from the hunchback to the other people in the cafe, and then her look was proud, and there was in it the hint of a threat, as though daring anyone to try to hold him to account for all his foolery.
Jeff was bringing in the suppers, already served on the plates, and the new electric fans in the cafe made a pleasant stir of coolness in the air. "The little young bunny's asleep," said Henry Macy finally. Miss Amelia looked down at the patient beside her, and composed her face for the matter in hand. The child's chin was resting on the table edge, and a trickle of spit or croup cure had bubbled from the corner of his mouth. His eyes were quite closed, and a little family of gnats had clustered peacefully in the corners. Miss Amelia put her hand on his head and shook it roughly, but the patient did not awake. So Miss Amelia lifted the child from the table, being careful not to touch the sore part of his leg, and went into the office. Henry Macy followed after her, and they closed the office door. Cousin Lyman was bored that evening. There was not much going on, and in spite of the heat the customers in the cafe were good-humored. Henry Ford Crimp and Horace Wells sat at the middle table with their arms around each other, sniggering over some long joke, but when he approached them he could make nothing of it as he had missed the beginning of the story. The moonlight brightened the dusty road, and the dwarfed peach trees were black and motionless. There was no breeze. The drowsy buzz of swamp mosquitoes was like an echo of the silent night. The town seemed dark, except far down the road to the right there was the flicker of a lamp. Somewhere in the darkness a woman sang in a high wild voice, and the tune had no start and no finish and was made up of only 3 notes which went on and on and on. The hunchback stood leaning against the banister of the porch, looking down the empty road as though hoping that someone would come along. There were footsteps behind him, then a voice, "Cousin Lyman, your dinner is set out upon the table." "My appetite is poor tonight," said the hunchback, who had been eating sweet snuff all the day. "There is a sourness in my mouth." "Just a pig," said Miss Amelia. "The breast, the liver, and the heart." Together they went back into the bright cafe and sat down with Henry Macy. Their table was the largest one in the cafe, and on it there was a bouquet of swamp lilies in a Coca-Cola bottle. Miss Amelia had finished with her patient and was satisfied with herself. From behind the closed office door there had come only a few sleepy whimpers, and before the patient could wake up and become terrified it was all over. The child was now slung across the shoulder of his father, sleeping deeply, his little arms dangling loose along his father's back, and his puffed up face very red. They were leaving the cafe to go home. Henry Macy was still silent. He ate carefully, making no noise when he swallowed, and was not a third as greedy as Cousin Lyman, who had claimed to have no appetite and was now putting down helping after helping of the dinner. Occasionally Henry Macy looked across at Miss Amelia and again held his peace. It was a typical Saturday night. An old couple who had come in from the country hesitated for a moment at the doorway, holding each other's hand, and finally decided to come inside. They had lived together so long, this old country couple, that they looked as similar as twins. They were brown, shriveled, and like 2 little walking peanuts. They left early, and by midnight most of the other customers were gone. Rosser Klein and Merle Ryan still played checkers, and Stumpy MacPhail sat with a liquor bottle on his table and carried on peaceable conversations with himself. Henry Macy had not yet got away, and this was unusual, as he almost always went to bed soon after nightfall. Miss Amelia yawned sleepily, but Lyman was restless and she did not suggest that they close up for the night. Finally, at 1 o'clock, Henry Macy looked up at the corner of the ceiling and said quietly to Miss Amelia, "I got a letter today." Miss Amelia was not one to be impressed by this, because all sorts of business letters and catalogs came addressed to her. "I got a letter from my brother," said Henry Macy. The hunchback, who had been goose-stepping about the cafe with his hands clasped behind his head, stopped suddenly. He was quick to sense any change in the atmosphere of a gathering. He glanced at each face in the room and waited. Miss Amelia scowled and hardened her right fist. "You are welcome to it," she said. "He is on parole. He is out of the penitentiary." The face of Miss Amelia was very dark, and she shivered although the night was warm. Stumpy MacPhail and Merle Ryan pushed aside their checker game. The cafe was very quiet. "Who?" asked Cousin Lyman. His large, pale ears seemed to grow on his head and stiffen. "What?" Miss Amelia slapped her hands palm down on the table. "Because Marvin Macy is a—" But her voice hoarsened, and after a few moments she only said, "He belongs to be in that penitentiary the balance of his life." "What did he do?" asked Cousin Lyman. There was a long pause, as no one knew exactly how to answer this. "He robbed 3 filling stations," said Stumpy MacPhail. But his words did not sound complete, and there was a feeling of sins left unmentioned. The hunchback was impatient. He could not bear to be left out of anything, even a great misery. The name Marvin Marcy was unknown to him, but it tantalized him as did any mention of subjects which others knew about and of which he was ignorant, such as any reference to the old sawmill that had been torn down before he came, or a chance word about poor Maurice Feinstein, or the recollection of any event that had occurred before his time. Aside from this inborn curiosity, the hunchback took a great interest in robbers and crimes of all varieties. As he strutted around the table, he was muttering the words "released on parole" and "penitentiary" to himself, but although he questioned insistently, he was unable to find anything, as nobody would dare to talk about Marvin Macy before Miss Amelia in the cafe. "The letter did not say very much," said Henry Macy. "He did not say where he was going." "Humph," said Amelia, and her face was still hardened and very dark. "He will never set his split hoof on my premises." She pushed back her chair from the table and made ready to close the cafe. Thinking about Marvin Macy may have set her to brooding, for she hauled the cash register back to the kitchen and put it in a private place. Henry Macy went off down the dark road, but Henry Ford crimped and Merle Ryan lingered for a time on the front porch. Later Merle Ryan was to make certain claims, to swear that on that night he had a vision of what was to come, but the town paid no attention, for that was just the sort of thing that Merle Ryan would claim. Miss Amelia and Cousin Lyman talked for a time in the parlor, and when at last the hunchback thought that he could sleep, she arranged the mosquito netting over his bed and waited until he had finished with his prayers. Then she put on her long nightgown, smoked 2 pipes, and only after a long time went to sleep. That autumn was a happy time. The crops around the countryside were good, and over at the Forks Falls market the price of tobacco held firm that year. After the long hot summer, the first cool days had a clean bright sweetness. Goldenrod grew along the dusty roads, and the sugar cane was ripe and purple. The bus came each day from Chiha to carry off a few of the younger children to the consolidated school to get an education. Boys hunted foxes in the pine woods, winter quilts were aired out on the wash lines, and sweet potatoes bedded in the ground with straw against the colder months to come. In the evening, delicate shreds of smoke rose from the chimneys, and the moon was round and orange in the autumn sky. There is no stillness like the quiet of the first cold nights in the fall. Sometimes, late in the night when there was no wind, there could be heard in the town the thin wild whistle of the train that goes through Society City on its way far off to the north. For Miss Amelia Evans this was a time of great activity. She was at work from dawn until sundown. She made a new and bigger condenser for her still, and in 1 week ran off enough liquor to souse the whole county. Her old mule was dizzy from grinding so much sorghum, and she scalded her mason jars and put away pear preserves. She was looking forward greatly to the first frost, because she had traded for 3 tremendous hogs, and intended to make much barbecue, chitterlings, and sausage. During these weeks there was a quality about Miss Amelia that many people noticed. She laughed often, with a deep ringing laugh, and her whistling had a sassy, tuneful trickery. She was forever trying out her strength, lifting up heavy objects, or poking her tough biceps with her finger. One day she sat down to her typewriter and wrote a story in which there were foreigners, trapdoors, and millions of dollars. Cousin Lyman was with her always, traipsing along behind her coat-tails, and when she watched him her face had a bright, soft look, and when she spoke his name there lingered in her voice the undertone of love. The first cold spell came at last. When Miss Amelia awoke one morning there were frost flowers on the window panes, and rime had silvered the patches of grass in the yard. Miss Amelia built a roaring fire in the kitchen stove, then went out of doors to judge the day. The air was cold and sharp, the sky pale green and cloudless. Very shortly people began to come in from the country to find out what Miss Amelia thought of the weather. She decided to kill the biggest hog, and word got.